My name is Camille Ashford. I'm 29 years old. 6 years ago, I missed the scholarship interview that could have changed my life because my parents needed the car for my sister's shopping trip. On the morning it happened, my father stood in the driveway and said, "Delaney needs Nordstrom. Your interview can wait." My mother added, "It's just an interview, Camille. Priorities." I stood there with my resume folder shaking in my hands, watching them pull out of the driveway without me. Then my sister rolled down the window and said one thing I never forgot. What she said that morning would come back to her in ways she never saw coming. And when my parents finally learned the truth 6 years later, our entire family didn't just break, it collapsed. If you're watching this right now, please hit subscribe and let me know in the comments where you're watching from. I read every single one. But first, let me take you back to the beginning of being invisible in my own family. I need you to understand something about my family. We weren't poor. We weren't uneducated. We looked perfectly normal from the outside. My father, Walter Ashford, owned a small commercial insurance agency in Overland Park, Kansas. 12 employees, decent reputation, a house with a 2-car garage, 2 daughters. On paper we were fine. But inside that house there was a hierarchy and I was at the bottom of it. My sister Delaney was 3 years younger than me, but you'd never know it from the way my parents treated her. She was the pretty one, the charming one, the one who could do no wrong even when she did everything wrong. He got a car at 16. I got a bus pass. He got a credit card for emergencies. I got a job at the grocery store the summer I turned 15 so I could pay for my own school supplies. My mother, Renee, ran the household like a business, and Delaney was the product she was investing in. Dance lessons, cheer camp, a personal tutor for the essay even though Delaney barely studied. Meanwhile, I was told to be practical. My mother's favorite phrase was, "Camille, you're the responsible one. You don't need the extra attention Delaney needs." Responsible. That word followed me everywhere. It meant I did the dishes every night without being asked. It meant I drove Delaney to cheer practice 3 times a week starting the year I got my license, unpaid, uncomplaining, because that's what responsible daughters did. It meant when my father's office assistant quit in 2016, I answered phones there after school for 2 years. No pay. Family doesn't pay family, my father said, the same line every single time I asked. By the time I was in 11th grade, I was functioning like a second mother to Delaney. I checked her homework. I covered for her when she snuck out. I lied to my parents twice when she came home smelling like beer because I knew if I told the truth, somehow it would become my fault for not stopping her. That was the pattern. Delaney's mistakes became my failures to manage her. My achievements became background noise. I brought home a 4.0 GPA freshman year. My mother said, "That's nice, honey," and went back to laminating Delaney's cheer schedule. Delaney brought home a C+ and a participation trophy, and my father took her out for ice cream to celebrate her effort. I stopped bringing home my report cards after a while. There was no point. I started keeping a mental ledger without meaning to. Every ride I gave Delaney. Every shift I covered at Dad's office. Every dollar I spent on my own clothes because the family budget, as my mother put it, was tight this year on account of Delaney's cheer nationals. I didn't resent her, not yet. I resented the arithmetic of our house, the quiet, constant math that always landed the same way. Delaney's wants were needs. My needs were requests, and requests could always wait. By senior year of high school, I had already decided college was my way out. Not just an education. An exit. I just didn't know yet how far my parents would go to keep that door closed. By the time Delaney turned 16, the gap between us wasn't subtle anymore. It was architecture. It was built into the walls of that house. There was a corkboard in the kitchen my mother called the achievement wall. It only ever held Delaney's things. Cheer competition ribbons. A photo of her holding a homecoming court sash. A flyer from a dance recital in Wichita where she'd had maybe 4 seconds of solo choreography. My straight A report cards never made it up there. I asked once when I was 15 if my honor roll certificate could go up too. My mother looked at me and said, "We don't want to clutter it, sweetie. Maybe put it in your room." Delaney didn't have a job in high school. She didn't need one. My parents gave her a monthly allowance of $200 starting at 14, for gas money and going out, they said, even though she didn't have a car yet. I found out about the allowance by accident, going through the family checkbook to find a receipt my mother asked me to locate. I never got an allowance. When I asked why, my father said, "You're just better with money than she is, Camille. She needs the structure." The structure. That was the word they used for everything that benefited Delaney. Structure, guidance, investment. What I got were different words. Responsibility, maturity, practicality. Looking back, I understand now those were just softer ways of saying you don't matter as much, so we're not going to spend on you. In 2015, when I was a sophomore, Delaney got caught cheating on a geometry test. The school called my mother. My mother's response wasn't anger at Delaney. It was anger at the teacher for embarrassing the family. She marched into that school in Overland Park with a binder of Delaney's old assignments, trying to argue the teacher had misjudged her. The suspension got reduced from 3 days to 1. Delaney came home and my father ordered pizza to, in his words, take the sting out of a hard week. That same semester, I placed second in the regional science fair with a water filtration project I'd built almost entirely with materials I bought myself from a hardware store in Lenexa. Nobody came to the awards ceremony. My mother had a hair appointment. My father said he had a client dinner. Delaney was supposed to drive me since she had her license by then, but she canceled last minute because a boy she liked asked her to get food. I took the bus home with my second-place ribbon in a paper bag, and nobody in that house asked to see it for 3 days. What made it worse wasn't just the favoritism. It was how normalized it became, how nobody outside the house seemed to question it either. My Aunt Roberta used to say at every family gathering, "Delaney's just got that spark, doesn't she?" As though warmth and charisma were currency, and quiet competence was worth nothing at all. My grandmother, before she passed, was one of the only people who ever pulled me aside and said, "You're the one who's going to do something with your life, Camille. Don't let them convince you otherwise." I held on to that sentence for years without fully understanding why I needed it so badly. By the time Delaney was a senior and I was in my first year at a state school in Manhattan, Kansas, on loans and a partial merit scholarship I'd fought for entirely on my own, my parents were already planning her future in a way they'd never planned mine. They talked about a gap year to find herself. They talked about maybe a small women's college near Springfield, Missouri, so she wouldn't be too far from home. They talked about funding it fully, no loans, no work study, nothing like what I'd had to piece together myself. I wasn't jealous of Delaney. I want to be clear about that even now. I was exhausted by the pattern. Exhausted by watching effort mean nothing and charm mean everything. Exhausted by being the daughter who was expected to succeed quietly, unfunded and unnoticed, while my sister was cheered for showing up at all. I didn't know yet that the biggest test of that pattern was still ahead of me, and that it would cost me the one chance I'd worked hardest for. College didn't free me from that house. It just changed the shape of the debt they expected me to pay. I was attending a state school in Manhattan, Kansas, 40 minutes from home, mostly because it was the only option I could afford without taking on crushing loans. I told myself the proximity was practical. What it actually meant was that my parents never stopped treating me like unpaid staff, just because I now had a dorm room instead of a bedroom down the hall. Every summer, from freshman year through junior year, I moved back to Overland Park and went straight back to work, answering phones at my father's insurance agency. Same arrangement as high school. Same line every time I brought up payment. Family doesn't pay family, Camille. This is how you contribute. I was 19, then 20, then 21, processing claims paperwork, managing the client database, training 2 different office assistants who were, ironically, both paid hourly wages while I was not. By my sophomore year, Delaney had graduated high school and enrolled at that small college near Springfield, Missouri, fully funded just like my parents promised. No loans. No work study. A furnished off-campus apartment my father co-signed for because, in his words, dorm life would be too stressful for her. I was living on ramen and a part-time job at a coffee shop in Iggyville just to cover my own textbooks. But it wasn't only the money. It was the time. Delaney called home constantly with what she called emergencies. A flat tire. A fight with a roommate. An overdraft on the checking account my parents funded for her. And every single time my mother's solution was the same. Camille, can you drive down there this weekend and help your sister sort this out? You're so much better at handling things than she is. So I did. I drove 3 hours to Springfield more times than I can count between 2017 and 2019, missing study groups, missing a campus interview for a research assistant position I badly wanted, missing my own roommate's birthday twice, to help my sister change a tire, or co-sign an apartment lease dispute, or sit with her at 2 in the morning because she was too upset to be alone after a breakup. I never once got a thank you that felt like it meant anything. I got, "You're a lifesaver, Cam," tossed off the way you'd thank someone for passing the salt. I did the math one night in my dorm room, unable to sleep the way I always did when the resentment got too loud to ignore. Between the unpaid office work every summer, roughly 15 hours a week for 12 weeks, that was 180 hours a summer, times 3 summers, 540 hours. Add the Springfield trips, at least 6 hours round trip. A dozen times over 2 years, another 72 hours. Over $2,000 of gas money out of my own pocket that nobody ever offered to reimburse. Minimum wage in Kansas at the time was $7.25 an hour. That put the unpaid office labor alone at just over $3,900 I'd given my father's business for free. It wasn't really about the money, though the money mattered more than they ever understood. It was about the fact that my 20s were being quietly scheduled around Delaney's convenience while my own goals kept getting pushed to whatever time was left over. I was carrying 18 credit hours most semesters, working a part-time job on top of the unpaid summer labor. And somehow I was still expected to be available the moment my sister needed rescuing. I remember one August afternoon in 2019, right before junior year started, sitting in my father's back office in Overland Park, filing claims paperwork until my hands ached, when Delaney called my mother in tears because she'd locked her keys in her car outside a mall in Springfield. My mother turned to me without even putting the phone down and said, "Camille, can you leave a little early and go help her?" I looked at the stack of paperwork still on my desk, the unpaid hours already logged for the week, and I said yes because that's what I always said. I drove 3 hours that evening to Jimmy open a car door for a sister who never once, not once, asked how my own week had gone. I didn't know it yet, but somewhere in the back of my mind, a decision was already forming. I couldn't keep pouring myself into a family that only ever poured back into one daughter. I needed something that was entirely mine, something they couldn't quietly redirect toward Delaney the way they redirected everything else. That something arrived in the spring of my junior year, in the form of an email I almost didn't open. The email came on a Tuesday afternoon in March of 2019. I was sitting in the campus library in Manhattan, Kansas, between classes, half paying attention to my inbox while I worked through a problem set. The subject line read, "Congratulations, you are a finalist." I almost deleted it, assuming it was spam the way half the scholarship solicitations in a college student's inbox are. But the sender was legitimate. The Harriman Foundation, a national organization based out of Denver, Colorado, that funded a small, highly competitive graduate fellowship for students pursuing public policy and economics. I had applied months earlier on a whim, staying up until 2 in the morning filling out the application after a full day of classes and an unpaid shift at my father's agency. I hadn't told anyone in my family. Part of it was superstition. Part of it was self-protection. I'd learned by then that telling my parents about something I wanted only ever gave them one more thing to overlook. The fellowship covered full tuition for a 2-year master's program, a living stipend of $18,000 a year, and most importantly, it came with a placement pipeline into policy research positions afterward. It was, without exaggeration, the single most significant opportunity of my life. Out of nearly 1,100 applicants nationwide, they had narrowed the pool to 60 finalists. I was one of them. The email explained the next step. A final round in-person interview, held at the Foundation's regional office in Kansas City, Missouri, on a Saturday morning in April. The interview panel would include 2 program directors and a former fellow. They emphasized, in bold text I read probably a dozen times, that this interview slot could not be rescheduled under any circumstances. Miss it and my file would be withdrawn from consideration entirely. I remember sitting there in the library, hands trembling slightly, reading that sentence over and over. Cannot be rescheduled. I closed my laptop, walked outside into the cold March air and just breathed for a minute. This was it. This was the door out. Not an exit from my family exactly, but an exit from the version of my life where my time and my future were treated as leftover resources. I spent the next 3 weeks preparing obsessively. I researched every board member of the foundation. I practiced answers in front of my roommate, Priya, who patiently sat through at least a dozen run-throughs of the same 3 interview questions. I bought a blazer from a consignment shop in Aggieville for $18 because it was the only professional clothing I owned that fit properly. I printed 6 copies of my resume in case and packed them in a folder I kept hidden at the bottom of my backpack. Kansas City was 2 hours from Overland Park, and the interview was scheduled for 10 in the morning. I planned to borrow my father's car, the only reliable vehicle in the family since my own was 15 years old and prone to overheating on the highway. I told my parents about the interview exactly once, 3 days before at dinner. I said it plainly. A national fellowship. Full ride for graduate school. An interview I could not miss. My mother said, "That's nice, honey," in the same flat tone she used for every report card I'd ever brought home. My father didn't say anything at all. He just kept eating. I should have known then. I should have recognized that silence for what it was. But I didn't. I went to bed that night thinking about the future, about Kansas City, about the life waiting for me on the other side of that Saturday morning. I had no idea my parents were already making other plans for that car. Saturday, April 13, 2019. I woke up at 6 in the morning even though I didn't need to leave until 8:30. I couldn't sleep past 5:30 anyway, my stomach too tight with nerves. I ironed the $18 blazer twice. I laid out my folder of resumes on the kitchen counter like it was something sacred. I made coffee I barely drank because my hands were shaking too much to hold the mug steady. At 7:45 I walked into the kitchen dressed and ready, keys to my father's Buick already in my hand from where they usually hung by the back door. My mother was standing in the kitchen in her robe, and something in her face told me immediately that the morning wasn't going to go the way I had planned. "Delaney needs the car today," she said, not looking up from the coffee she was pouring. I remember the exact stillness that settled over me. "I have my interview in Kansas City. I told you about this 3 days ago." "I know, honey, but Delaney has a bridal shower to get to in Wichita for her roommate and she needs something to wear. It's a whole thing. You understand. A whole thing." I stood there holding a folder of resumes for a fellowship that 1,100 people had applied for, and my mother was telling me a shopping trip for a bridesmaid dress was a whole thing. My father walked in a moment later, coffee mug in hand, and didn't even pretend to be surprised. "Your sister already left for the mall in Wichita with your car actually," he said, glancing at me. "Hers wouldn't start this morning. We figured yours could get you partway, and Delaney needed something reliable for the highway. They had taken my car. Not offered me theirs. Taken mine, the 15-year-old sedan with the overheating problem, and handed it to Delaney for a shopping trip, while planning to strand me with nothing. "I have an interview in 90 minutes, I said again, my voice climbing. "In Kansas City. This is the fellowship I told you about. It cannot be rescheduled." My mother's expression didn't change. "Camille, it's just an interview. There will be other scholarships. This is Delaney's best friend's bridal shower. She's a bridesmaid. She needs the right outfit." I looked at my father, waiting for him to say something different, to be the reasonable one for once. Instead he said, "You're being a little dramatic, don't you think? It's not like the interview is going anywhere. Call them, explain the situation, ask for another time." I told him, my voice shaking now, that the email had explicitly said the interview slot could not be rescheduled under any circumstances. He waved a hand like I was exaggerating a minor inconvenience. "Everything's negotiable if you ask nicely enough." That's when Delaney texted my mother a photo from the mall in Wichita, standing in front of a dressing room mirror in a pale green dress, captioned with 3 exclamation points. My mother turned the phone toward me, smiling. "Doesn't she look beautiful? This is important to her, sweetheart." I stood in that kitchen at 8 in the morning, 90 minutes from the most important interview of my life, watching my mother beam at a photo of my sister trying on a bridesmaid dress in a mall 2 hours in the opposite direction from where I needed to be. I asked if I could borrow my father's Buick instead, since Delaney had taken mine. He said he needed it that morning for a client meeting he'd apparently forgotten to mention until that exact moment. When I asked if someone could drive me or if I could take a bus, my mother sighed like I was the one being unreasonable. "Camille, you get one interview like this and suddenly the whole household has to stop. You'll figure something out. You always do." I called a rideshare app with shaking hands, praying the fare wouldn't be more than the $11 I had in my checking account. The nearest driver was 40 minutes away, in a rural area with limited coverage. By the time anything could have gotten me to Kansas City, the interview slot would have already closed. I stood in that kitchen and watched my parents go about their morning like nothing had happened, my father finishing his coffee, my mother texting Delaney back with heart emojis about the dress. And somewhere in Kansas City at 10 o'clock exactly, a panel of 3 people sat down at a table with an empty chair where I was supposed to be. I sent one email at 9:52 that morning from my phone, sitting on the back porch steps because I couldn't stand to be in that kitchen anymore. I wrote to the Foundation's program coordinator, a woman named Dr. Patricia Voss, explaining as calmly as I could manage that a family emergency had made it impossible for me to reach Kansas City on time, and asking if there was any way to reschedule. The reply came 4 hours later, polite and final. "We understand emergencies happen and we're sorry to hear about your circumstances. Unfortunately, as outlined in our finalist communication, interview slots cannot be rescheduled due to the compressed timeline of our selection process. We wish you the best in your future endeavors." I read that email standing in the driveway, still in the $18 blazer I'd ironed twice that morning, and I felt something in my chest cave in completely. Not anger yet. Just a hollow, bottomless disappointment, the kind that makes your legs feel unsteady even though you're not moving. I didn't cry in front of my parents. I went up to my childhood bedroom, the one that had slowly become storage for Delaney's old cheer uniforms and prom dresses over the years, and I sat on the floor because the bed was covered in boxes, and I cried until I physically couldn't anymore. Delaney came home around 6 that evening, breezing through the front door with a garment bag over her shoulder, glowing from her day at the mall in Wichita. She found me in the kitchen and held up the pale green dress like she expected me to admire it. "Isn't it perfect?" I found matching shoes too. When I didn't respond, she finally seemed to register something was wrong. "What's with you?" "I missed my interview," I said. "The fellowship. Kansas City. You took my car." She blinked, genuinely confused for a second, like she'd forgotten the interview existed at all despite me mentioning it at dinner 3 days earlier. "Oh, that's today. I didn't realize it was such a big deal. I mean, you can just apply again next year, right?" I didn't answer her. I went back upstairs. Over the following weeks, I told myself different versions of what had happened, trying to make it hurt less. Maybe I wasn't ready for that level of opportunity anyway. Maybe the interview would have gone badly regardless. Maybe this was simply proof I wasn't cut out for something that big. I didn't yet have the language for what had actually happened to me. I just had the shame of having missed it and the quiet, corrosive belief that I had somehow failed on my own. My parents never apologized. Not once. My father brought it up exactly one time 2 weeks later at dinner saying, "You'll land on your feet, Camille. You always do," as though the missed interview had been an act of God rather than a decision made in a kitchen in Overland Park, Kansas, on a Saturday morning in April. I finished my junior year in a fog. I kept working at my father's agency that summer because I still didn't have anywhere else to put my labor, and because some old, stubborn part of me still hoped that eventually, if I just did enough, someone in that house would finally notice. Nobody did. By senior year, I had stopped applying for anything ambitious. I told myself it was practicality. Deep down, I knew it was fear. I applied instead to a handful of entry-level administrative jobs in Kansas City and Topeka, the kind of positions that required a degree but not much of a future. I graduated in May of 2020 into a shut-down world reeling from the pandemic with a diploma, $6,000 in loans, and a version of myself that had quietly given up on believing anything good was allowed to happen to her. I didn't know it then, sitting in that fog, but the version of me that missed that interview in a borrowed blazer was about to spend the next several years rebuilding herself from absolutely nothing. And I had no idea yet just how far that rebuilding would eventually take me, or how directly it would one day intersect with the sister who took my car to a bridal shower in Wichita without a second thought. I graduated in May of 2020 into a world that had shut its doors in every direction. No graduation ceremony. No job fairs. Every entry-level policy or research position I'd once imagined applying for had frozen its hiring. I moved into a $600 a month studio apartment in Topeka, Kansas, 40 minutes from my parents, close enough that I still felt obligated to show up when Delaney needed something, far enough that I could finally start building a wall between myself and that house. I took the first job I could find, a data entry position at a regional insurance claims processor, paying $14 an hour. It had nothing to do with public policy or economics or anything I'd once dreamed about in that college library. It paid rent, and that was enough for a while. I want to be honest about how dark that first year was. I worked from a card table in my studio apartment because I couldn't afford a proper desk. I ate a lot of rice and canned beans. I called my parents maybe twice a month out of obligation, and every single call somehow circled back to Delaney, who had moved back home after her college near Springfield, Missouri, closed its campus during the pandemic and was, according to my mother, figuring out her next chapter while living rent-free and unemployed in my parents' basement. In October of 2020, 5 months after graduating, I started taking free online courses at night after my data entry shifts. Financial analysis, advanced Excel, a certificate program in data visualization through a platform I found for $40 a month. I didn't have money for a formal graduate degree, not after the fellowship fell through, but I had a laptop and I had nights, and slowly I started building something that felt like mine again. I applied to 62 jobs over the following 8 months. 61 rejections or silence. 1 callback from a mid-sized financial analytics firm headquartered in Kansas City, Missouri, called Ferris Whitlock Group. The role was junior financial analyst, $42,000 a year, benefits, and an actual career track. I interviewed twice, once over video, once in person at their downtown office. I got the offer in July of 2021. I moved to Kansas City that August into a slightly better apartment for $150 more a month than I could really afford, but 40 minutes further from Overland Park, and that distance felt like oxygen. I told my parents about the move in a single phone call. My mother's response was, "That's exciting, honey. Kansas City's expensive though, isn't it? Are you sure you can manage on your own?" My father asked if I needed anything, and when I said no, he sounded almost disappointed, like part of him had expected me to fail without their support and was thrown off when I didn't. The first year at Ferris Whitlock was brutal in the way that rebuilding always is. I stayed late constantly. I volunteered for every project nobody else wanted, the messy client reconciliations, the reports due at midnight before a board meeting. My supervisor, a sharp, no-nonsense woman named Denise Okafor, noticed. She pulled me aside about 4 months in and said, "You work like someone trying to prove something." What's the story there? I didn't tell her the whole story. I just said I'd had a setback once and wasn't planning on having another. She became something close to a mentor after that. She encouraged me to pursue a professional certification in financial planning, and when I told her I couldn't afford it, she told me the firm had a tuition reimbursement policy nobody used because nobody ever asked. I studied for that certification during my lunch breaks and most weekends for 4 months, and I passed it in March of 2022. It was the first professional credential that had my name on it, earned entirely on my own terms, with no one taking my car out from under me the morning it mattered. I framed the certificate and hung it in my apartment, not because I needed to look at it every day but because I needed at least once to see proof that I had built something they couldn't touch, couldn't redirect, and couldn't quietly hand over to somebody else. I didn't know it yet, but that certification and the years of work that came after it were about to put me in a position I never could have imagined, sitting in that library in Manhattan, Kansas, back in 2019, filling out a fellowship application in secret at 2 a.m. The certification changed the trajectory of everything, though not overnight. In June of 2022, 3 months after I passed it, Denise recommended me for a promotion to senior financial analyst. $54,000 a year, up from $42,000. I remember sitting in my car in the parking garage after getting the news, calling no one because there was no one in my family I actually wanted to tell. I called my old college roommate, Priya, instead, who screamed loud enough that I had to hold the phone away from my ear. Over the next 2 years, I built a reputation at Ferris Whitlock Group as the person who could untangle the accounts nobody else wanted to touch. I specialized, almost by accident, in corporate compliance auditing, reviewing client portfolios for regulatory risk. It was detailed, unglamorous work, and I was good at it in a way that quietly surprised people who'd underestimated me my whole life. In January of 2023, I was promoted again to compliance manager, overseeing a small team of 3 analysts. $71,000 a year. I moved into a proper 1-bedroom apartment in the Crossroads district of Kansas City, the kind of place with actual counter space and a bedroom door that closed all the way. I started therapy that same year in March, after a particularly difficult phone call with my mother left me shaking for 2 hours afterward. My therapist, a calm, direct woman named Dr. Alvarez, was the first person who ever said the sentence back to me that I needed to hear. You don't owe them access to your peace just because they share your last name. I want to be clear that this period wasn't just career success. It was rebuilding a self that had spent 22 years believing her needs were requests that could always wait. I learned what boundaries actually meant, not as a buzzword but as a practice. I stopped answering every call from my mother immediately. I stopped driving 3 hours to fix problems that weren't mine to fix. I started saving aggressively, and by the end of 2023, I had $11,000 in savings for the first time in my life, money that existed only because I decided it should. In February of 2024, Denise called me into her office and told me the firm was expanding its compliance division into a standalone department, and she wanted me to lead it. Director of Compliance and Risk. $98,000 a year, an actual office with a window overlooking downtown Kansas City, and a team that would grow to 8 people within the year. I remember standing in that office afterward, looking out at the skyline, and thinking about the girl who had once cried on her bedroom floor in Overland Park because a bridesmaid dress had mattered more than her future. I built out my department over the following year methodically, the same way I'd built everything else, one deliberate decision at a time. I hired carefully. I trained thoroughly. I put together onboarding protocols and performance review structures that other departments at the firm eventually adopted as the internal standard. By early 2025, Ferris Whitlock Group's compliance division, which I had built from a 2-person afterthought into an 8-person department with a clean audit record, had become something the firm's leadership pointed to when courting new institutional clients. I kept my personal life quiet during this stretch. I dated occasionally, nothing serious. I saw my parents maybe 4 times a year, holidays mostly, and kept the visits short and controlled. Delaney, meanwhile, had moved through a string of jobs after finally leaving my parents' basement in late 2022. A retail management position in Wichita that lasted 8 months. A brief stint doing social media marketing for a boutique that closed within a year. Nothing that stuck, though my mother described each one to relatives as though Delaney had landed the opportunity of a lifetime. I didn't think much about Delaney during those years, honestly. I'd built a wall high enough that her chaos rarely reached me anymore. I had no idea that wall was about to come down in the most unexpected way possible, through an application that landed on my desk on an ordinary Tuesday morning in April of 2025, 6 years almost to the week after a bridesmaid dress cost me the biggest opportunity of my life. It was a Tuesday morning in April of 2025. And I was at my desk in the Crossroads office reviewing applications for a compliance analyst opening on my team. We'd posted the role 2 weeks earlier and received close to 70 applications. I was scrolling through the applicant tracking system with a cup of coffee going cold beside me, the way I did most mornings when a name stopped me cold. Delaney Ashford. My coffee cup stayed exactly where it was. I sat there for a moment just staring at the screen, half convinced it was a coincidence. A different Delaney Ashford, though the name wasn't exactly common. I clicked into the file. The resume loaded, clean formatting, a professional template. Delaney Ashford, Compliance and Financial Operations Specialist. My stomach tightened before I even got to the work history. I scrolled down. Ferris Whitlock Group didn't appear anywhere, of course, since she'd never worked there. But what did appear stopped me completely. Under her most recent position, it read Compliance Coordinator, Whitfield Regional Insurance, Overland Park, Kansas, January 2019 to March 2021. Bullet points beneath it. Managed regulatory documentation for a 12-employee insurance agency. Coordinated client file audits and compliance reporting. Reduced processing errors by 30% through improved filing systems. Trained 2 office staff members on updated compliance procedures. I read it 3 times. Whitfield Regional Insurance wasn't a real company. It was a name close enough to sound plausible, but it didn't exist in any business registry I could think to check. And every single duty listed underneath it was work I had done, unpaid, at my father's actual insurance agency in Overland Park, during those exact years, while Delaney had been away at her funded college near Springfield, Missouri, and later sitting in my parents' basement during the pandemic. I opened her references. 3 listed. First, Walter Ashford, owner. Description simply former supervisor. My own father. Second, a woman named Carla Jennings, listed as a professional colleague, someone I didn't recognize at all. Third, my mother, Renee Ashford, listed under administrative reference, described as having worked alongside Delaney coordinating scheduling and client relations. My own parents, listed as fabricated professional references for a job my sister had never held, describing work I had actually done. Our standard hiring protocol at Ferris Whitlock required employment verification on every finalist before an offer went out. No exceptions, something I'd personally written into the compliance department's onboarding policy less than a year earlier. I had 2 options in front of me. I could flag the file for conflict of interest and hand it to another member of my team, recuse myself entirely and never think about it again. Or I could follow protocol exactly the way I would for any other applicant, and let the process reveal whatever it was going to reveal. I thought about the $18 blazer I'd ironed twice on an April morning 6 years earlier. I thought about my father's voice telling me the interview slot was negotiable if I just asked nicely enough. I thought about Delaney holding up a pale green dress in my parents' kitchen, asking if it was perfect, while I stood there having just lost the biggest opportunity of my life. I chose option 2. I pulled up Delaney's public LinkedIn profile first. Her employment history there matched the fabricated resume almost exactly, down to the fictional job title at the fictional company. Her profile picture showed her in a blazer, smiling confidently, bio reading compliance professional, detail-oriented, results-driven. I checked the years surrounding the Whitfield Regional Insurance listing more carefully. Before that, a 6-month gap. After it, an 8-month stint at a retail store in Wichita, then another gap, then the social media role at the boutique that had closed. No consistent employment history longer than roughly 2 years anywhere. And that 2-year stretch, the one that looked the most substantial and professional on paper, was the one she had invented entirely out of my own unpaid labor. Before making any decision, I opened Ferris Whitlock's internal fellowship and hiring archive out of habit, searching my own name the way I sometimes did to make sure our old records were properly filed. Nothing came back related to the Harriman Foundation, of course, since that had never been connected to this company. But the search reminded me of something I hadn't let myself think about directly in years. I opened a browser and, for the first time since 2019, searched the Harriman Foundation's public website. They still existed, still ran the same fellowship. And buried in an alumni spotlight page, dated from 2021, was a name I recognized. Dr. Patricia Voss, the program coordinator who had emailed me that final, polite rejection 6 years earlier, was now the Foundation's executive director. I sat at my desk for a long time after that, the compliance analyst application still open on my screen, my sister's fabricated resume staring back at me, and I understood that 2 entirely separate parts of my life, one buried for 6 years and one sitting in my inbox that morning, were about to collide in a way I never could have planned. I decided to run standard employment verification before I did anything else, the same procedure I would follow for any candidate. I picked up my office phone and dialed the number listed for Whitfield Regional Insurance on Delaney's resume. It rang twice before a recorded message informed me the number was no longer in service. I searched the business name in the Kansas Secretary of State's registry. Nothing. No such company had ever been registered in the state. Whitfield Regional Insurance did not exist and had never existed. I called my father's actual agency next, the real one, still operating in Overland Park under its real name. His longtime office manager, a woman named Sheila who had worked there since before I was born, picked up. I kept my voice professional and gave her my title. This is Camille Ashford, calling from Ferris Whitlock Group in Kansas City. I'm conducting an employment verification for an applicant named Delaney Ashford, who has listed compliance work in the insurance industry between 2019 and 2021. There was a pause on the line. Camille, is that really you, honey? Sheila's voice softened, and then something in it shifted when she realized what I was actually asking. Delaney never worked here, sweetheart. You know that better than anyone. You were the one answering those phones every summer. I asked her directly whether she was aware of any arrangement where my father might have agreed to serve as a reference for Delaney at a different fictional company. Sheila hesitated. I don't know anything about that. But Camille, I remember exactly whose hands were on that filing system for 2 years, and it wasn't your sister's. I thanked her and hung up, and then I called my father directly from my office line, explaining I was conducting a standard verification call and needed to confirm some details. I didn't tell him who I was at first. I simply asked the questions. I'm calling to verify employment for Delaney Ashford, who has listed you as a reference for a compliance coordinator position at Whitfield Regional Insurance in Overland Park, from January 2019 to March 2021. Can you confirm those details? There was a long silence before he spoke. Yes, that's correct. She did excellent work for us. Very reliable, very detail-oriented. Can you describe her day-to-day responsibilities? She managed our compliance documentation, coordinated audits, trained some of our newer staff on procedures. His voice was steady, practiced, like he'd said these exact words before, possibly even to Delaney herself as a script. And during that same period, January 2019 to March 2021, did any other family member perform those same duties at your agency? Another pause, longer this time. No. Just Delaney. That was the lie that confirmed everything. Because I existed. I had been there, unpaid, for 2 full years doing exactly the work now attributed to a sister who had been 3 hours away at a fully funded college during most of that window, and later sitting in my parents' basement during the rest of it. I had old email threads from my father's real business account addressed to me, coordinating claims. I had text messages from 2019 and 2020 where my mother asked me to cover shifts. I had a paper trail 6 years deep proving I was the one who had actually done this work for free, while being told family doesn't pay family. I thanked my father for his time, still without revealing who I was, and ended the call. I sat there for several minutes afterward, hands steady in a way that almost surprised me. I wasn't shaking the way I had been in that kitchen 6 years earlier. I felt something closer to clarity. I wrote one line in Delaney's applicant file. Employment verification incomplete. Listed employer unregistered. Discrepancies identified. Recommend in-person interview to address directly. Then I opened a new browser tab and did something I hadn't let myself do in 6 years. I emailed the Harriman Foundation directly, addressed to Dr. Patricia Voss, explaining briefly who I was, reminding her of my 2019 finalist file, and asking whether it would be possible to speak with her about what had actually happened that April morning, and about a discovery I had just made that I believed she needed to know about as well. I didn't know if she would remember me at all, out of the 1,100 applicants that cycle. But I sent it anyway because for the first time in 6 years, I wasn't willing to let that morning stay buried under a bridesmaid dress and a lie about a car that wouldn't start. I scheduled Delaney's interview for the following Monday, sending it through our standard applicant portal like any other candidate. Dear Delaney, thank you for your application to the compliance analyst position at Ferris Whitlock Group. We would like to invite you for an in-person interview on Monday, April 21st, at 10 a.m. at our Kansas City office. You will meet with Camille Ashford, Director of Compliance and Risk, and Denise Okafor, Chief Operating Officer. She replied within the hour. Thank you so much. I'll be there. Looking forward to it. No recognition of my name. No pause, no question, no hesitation at all. 6 years of near silence between us, and she hadn't even registered that the director interviewing her shared her last name and her exact face structure, or she simply hadn't thought to wonder. I told Denise everything the day before, laying out the fabricated company, the fake references, my father's confirming lie on the phone. Denise listened without interrupting, then said only, "You lead it. I'll sit in as a witness. Whatever you decide to do, I trust your judgment completely." Monday morning, I sat in our small conference room at 9:55, watching the lobby through the glass wall. At 9:58, Delaney walked in, hairstyled, wearing a fitted navy blazer, clutching a leather portfolio she'd clearly bought specifically for this. She looked older than the last time I'd seen her, tired in a way that makeup couldn't quite cover. She checked in at the front desk and the receptionist pointed her toward our office. I stood and walked out to greet her. She looked up, saw my face, and froze completely, the color draining out of her cheeks. "Camille." Her voice cracked. "I didn't know you worked here." 6 years is a long time, I said. "Things change. Please follow me." She followed, heels unsteady on the tile, breathing audibly quicker as we passed the glass conference room where Denise was already waiting. I gestured for her to sit facing both of us. I took the center chair. "Let's get started," I said, my voice calm, professional. "Walk us through your resume." The first several minutes were standard questions about software, about time management, about handling client discrepancies. Delaney answered adequately, visibly nervous but rehearsed. Then Denise leaned forward. "I see you worked at Whitfield Regional Insurance in Overland Park. Tell me about that role." "Yes, I was a compliance coordinator there for about 2 years. Small family-adjacent business. I managed documentation, coordinated audits, trained staff." Her voice was steady but her hands weren't. "And what years were those exactly?" "January 2019 to March 2021. Full-time." I slid the printed resume across the table and pointed to the line. I called to verify this employment last week. There's no business registered under that name anywhere in Kansas. I also called Dad's actual agency. Our father's actual agency. Sheila still works there. She confirmed you never worked a single day in that office. Delaney's face went through 3 colors in rapid succession, pale, then red, then a blotchy, cornered white. I did help out sometimes. I did some of that work. You did none of that work, I said, still calm. I did every single hour of it, unpaid, for 2 years while you were at school in Springfield and then living in their basement. Every bullet point on this resume is my labor with your name attached to it. I needed something on my resume that looked real, Camille. I've had 6 jobs in 4 years. Nobody will hire me with what I actually have. So you took mine. She started crying then, not delicate tears, the kind of crying that comes apart at the edges. You don't understand what it's been like. Mom and Dad stopped helping the second I moved out. I've had nothing to build on. I built everything I have without them helping at all, I said. You had everything handed to you and you still couldn't hold on to any of it, so you reached back and took the one thing that was mine. That's when Denise's phone buzzed on the table between us, screen lighting up with a message from our head of HR. Our office had a standing policy, unbeknownst to most staff, that all final round interviews for roles handling sensitive compliance data were recorded for training and audit purposes, disclosed in fine print on every applicant's consent form Delaney had signed electronically the week before. Every word of what had just been said was already on record. Denise ended the interview formally a few minutes later, telling Delaney that Ferris Whitlock could not move forward given the confirmed misrepresentation, and that per company policy, the fabricated employment history would be noted in our internal hiring records. Delaney left the building in tears and I didn't walk her out. I sat in that conference room for a few minutes afterward, and for the first time in 6 years I didn't feel hollow. I felt finished. The call started that same evening. My mother first at 7:15. How could you humiliate your sister like that? In front of her potential employer? Do you understand what you've done to her chances? I let it go to voicemail. My father called an hour later, his message shorter, colder. This is a family matter, Camille. You didn't need to make it a workplace incident. Call me back. I didn't call either of them back that night. The next morning my mother texted a paragraph that began, I don't know what happened to you. You used to be such a caring girl, and ended with, your sister is devastated. Fix this. I read it twice and put my phone face down on my desk. 2 days later I finally called my father, mostly because I wanted to say one thing directly rather than let it sit unsaid. I asked him plainly why he had lied on that verification call, confirming employment history for a company that never existed. He was quiet for a long moment. I didn't think anyone would actually check, Camille. Your sister asked me to help her. I didn't think it would matter. It mattered 6 years ago too, I said. The morning you took my car. He didn't have an answer for that. The silence on the line lasted almost 30 seconds before he simply said, I have to go, and hung up. I sent a brief, factual email to Dr. Patricia Voss at the Harriman Foundation later that week, since she'd responded warmly to my earlier message and asked to hear the full story. I explained what had happened in 2019 and separately what I just discovered about Delaney's fabricated resume, not asking for anything, just wanting the record finally to reflect the truth. She wrote back within a day, saying she remembered my finalist file specifically, that my written application materials had been among the strongest in that year's pool, and that she was, in her words, genuinely sorry an administrative rigidity cost a promising candidate her shot, and troubled to learn the reason behind it. 3 weeks after the interview, my mother showed up unannounced at my apartment building in Kansas City. I let her up, mostly out of curiosity about what she planned to say. She sat on my couch, looked around at the apartment I had built entirely without their help, and said, Delaney doesn't have anything, Camille. You have all of this. Would it kill you to help your sister just once? I helped her for 2 years for free, I said. That's the part everyone in this family seems to forget. She didn't have a response to that either. She left 20 minutes later and I haven't heard from Delaney directly since. My father sends the occasional distant text around holidays. My mother calls every few months, conversations that stay carefully on the surface. I don't think any of them have fully reckoned with what happened. I'm not sure they ever will. It's been almost a year now since that Monday morning in the conference room. I'm still at Ferris Whitlock Group, still leading the compliance department I built from nothing. We brought on a new analyst that spring, someone with an honest resume and real references, and the role has nothing to do with what happened. Life mostly moved on the way it does. I heard through a cousin that Delaney is working retail again, somewhere outside Wichita. I don't know the details and I've stopped asking. My father sent a text on my birthday this year for words, "Thinking of you, kiddo," and I didn't answer it right away. I'm not sure I answered it out of forgiveness or just habit. I think I'm still figuring that part out. I finally reapplied to a graduate program last fall, not through the Harriman Foundation, but through a part-time public policy certificate at a university here in Kansas City, paid for entirely with my own savings. I start classes in the evenings this January. It's not the fellowship I lost in 2019. It's something steadier, something built slower, and it's entirely mine. I think about that morning in the kitchen sometimes, the pale green dress, the folder of resumes I never got to hand anyone. For a long time I believed that missing that interview meant I wasn't capable of the life I'd wanted. It took me years to understand it had never been about capability at all. It was about a family that had already decided long before that Saturday, whose time mattered and whose didn't. I don't know if my parents will ever fully understand what they did, either that morning or in the 6 years of silence that followed it. But I've stopped waiting for that understanding to arrive before I let myself move forward. I built a life without their permission once already. I know how to do it again if I need to. If you've ever been the daughter who was expected to wait, to give, to disappear quietly into usefulness while someone else got the spotlight, I hope this reached you today. Drop a comment and tell me where you're watching from, and if this story meant something to you, hit subscribe. There are more stories like this coming, real boundaries, real consequences, real people finally being seen. Thank you for listening.